All right, let's get ready to dive deep, folks. Today, we're stepping into a world where, you've got intricate designs and just amazing engineering. We're talking about the Moorish influence on European architecture.
Okay, yeah.
You know, those buildings, they got the arches, the tile work, all that.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, and, we often think about them as European, but you might be surprised to learn how much of that style is really rooted in Moorish innovation.
It's really fascinating, isn't it?
It is. It is.
And the thing is that the Moors weren't just kind of like passing through Europe.
Right.
They were in Al-Andalus.
Okay.
And that's the Iberian Peninsula, by the way, for those who, need a little geography refresher.
Yeah, yeah.
But they were there for over 700 years.
Wow.
That's longer than the United States has even been around.
Yeah.
So yeah, their impact on the region's architecture, it was major.
700 years. That's a long time to make a mark on a place. So let's break it down. When we talk about Moorish architecture, what are the things that really stand out? What should our listeners be picturing in their minds?
Well, you got to think arches. But not just any arches. They really mastered this thing. It's called the horseshoe arch and also the multifoil arch.
Okay.
These became like their signature, like their architectural calling card.
I see.
But they weren't just about the look,
Right.
These arches show a deep understanding of engineering. You know how structures work. Like the horseshoe arch, it distributes weight differently than a typical arch, and that let them make wider spaces, more open spaces.
So it's like they were pushing the limits of what you could even do with architecture at the time.
Exactly. They were innovators. And then there's the mucornas.
Yeah.
This intricate honeycomb vaulting. I mean, can you imagine decorating ceilings and domes with this stuff? It's like this explosion of geometric shapes, like a puzzle, but it's three-dimensional and made of plaster or carved stone.
I'm trying to picture it.
So pretty amazing.
Yeah. And then there's those patterns, those hypnotic geometric and arabesque patterns. They're everywhere. From the tiles to the carved stucco. It's like an obsession with pattern.
Well, it wasn't just an obsession. There was a reason behind it.
Oh, okay.
See, Islamic art traditionally avoids human figures.
Okay.
So the Moors, they focused on these intricate designs instead. Nothing figurative, emphasizing symmetry and repetition, all reflecting their belief that God is infinite.
So, like every detail, even the smallest thing, had a deeper meaning.
Exactly. Art and spirituality, totally intertwined.
Yeah, yeah.
And here's something else. These patterns, they didn't just stay in the architecture. They started showing up in European decorative arts, in textiles, even bookbinding. Shows you how broad their influence really was.
That is amazing. It's like they combined art and engineering and spirituality all together into one thing.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just about, how things looked, right? They were really advancing engineering and building techniques, too.
Oh, totally. They were pioneers in many ways.
Okay.
Like, think about ribbed vaulting. Those really tall vaults you see in Gothic cathedrals?
Yeah, yeah.
Ribbed vaulting was actually like an early version of that. It's this technique where you use these thin ribs of stone, and they support the vault. It allowed for thinner walls, bigger windows. And the Moors were using this way before it caught on in Europe.
It's like they laid the groundwork for some of the most iconic features in architecture we see today.
Exactly. And we can't forget about their advanced masonry. They were great with brickwork, too. They used super strong materials and these incredibly intricate tile designs. And those actually became a big part of European architectural styles later on. And then there's the whole thing about water, how they managed it.
Yeah, their water systems. They were brilliant, seriously. I was reading about how they built aqueducts and these underground water channels to bring fresh water to their cities. It's just incredible.
I get this. A lot of those systems are still working today.
No way.
Hundreds of years later. It wasn't just about, having enough to drink. It was about creating comfortable living in a really hot, dry climate.
They were ahead of their time thinking about sustainability.
Absolutely. They really understood how to work with nature, not against it. And all those innovations with water, that paved the way for more advanced systems all throughout Europe.
So we've talked about the arches, the patterns, the engineering, but what about life in a Moorish city? What was it like?
Okay, picture this. You're walking through a Medina.
Okay.
It's bustling, narrow streets winding around, shaded by awnings and balconies. You can hear people talking, smell spices in the air, a metal worker hammering away. The streets might seem kind of chaotic at first, but there's actually a system to it all.
There's a method to the madness.
That's right. It wasn't all just palaces and mosques. They thought about how to make functional spaces, lively urban spaces for everyday life.
Exactly.
They got a city, it's not just a bunch of buildings, it's like a living thing. And those narrow streets, they weren't just for shade.
Right.
It was about building community. You're always bumping into people, interacting.
Yeah, yeah.
And what about those courtyards we talked about? Huge part of Moorish urban design.
Yeah, tell me more about those.
They were like little oases of peace in the middle of all that city life. Shade, cool air. And often they were decorated, fountains, plants, and that intricate tile work. It was where families would get together, kids would play, and neighbors would hang out.
Sounds like they were really ahead of the game when it comes to city planning,
Mm.
designing spaces that work and look good too. But, for most people, when they think about Moorish architecture, they think of some very specific buildings.
Mhm.
And I think we got to talk about a few of those.
Oh, for sure. There's so many amazing examples out there. But if we had to pick just a few, must-see spots, you got to start with the Alhambra in Granada, Spain.
The Alhambra. It even sounds like magical. What is it about this place that's so special?
Well, they call it a palace city, and when you see it, you'll know why.
Okay.
It's not just one building, it's this huge complex. Palaces, gardens, courtyards, fortifications, all of it up on a hill looking over the city of Granada.
Wow, it sounds breathtaking.
Oh, it is, trust me. Every little detail, the stucco work, those colorful tile mosaics, the reflecting pools, the gardens, it's all meant to create this sense of wonder.
And speaking of awe-inspiring, we can't forget the Great Mosque of Córdoba.
Ah, yes.
It's got that incredible forest of columns and those horseshoe arches. It's just, you can't even imagine the scale till you're standing inside it.
It's one of those places that just leaves you speechless. You walk in and it's like this endless sea of arches and the light coming in through all those windows. It's almost like stepping into another world.
And it was converted into a cathedral later on, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it still has so much of that Moorish character.
Yeah.
It's like this living reminder of how cultures blend and how powerful Moorish design really was.
Exactly. It's like architectural history. It's not a straight line,
Yeah?
It's all about evolution and adaptation and things blending together. And the Great Mosque, it's the perfect example of that.
Okay, last but not least, the Giralda in Seville. Now, this one is a little different, right?
Yeah, the Giralda is super interesting because it was originally a minaret. That's the tower where Muslims are called to prayer.
Okay, yeah.
But then when Seville was reconquered by the Christians, they decided to keep the tower. They transformed it into the bell tower of Seville Cathedral.
So it went from like a symbol of Islam to a symbol of Christianity.
That's right.
That's amazing.
It really is. And it's wild how well those two styles just blend together. You got this tall Moorish tower, intricate brickwork, the decorative patterns, but then on top, a Renaissance belfry. It's like this unique mix of architectural styles.
The Giralda. It's like a visual representation of how, architectural history is not just one thing after another. It's about sharing and adapting and fusion. But Moorish influence didn't stop after the Reconquista, right? I mean, they left such a huge mark on Spain, on Portugal.
You're absolutely right. Even after their rule was over, their architecture lived on. It actually created this whole new style called Mudejar architecture.
Mudejar architecture. I don't think I'm familiar with it.
Think of it like a beautiful conversation happening between two cultures, Islamic and Christian,
Okay.
came about in the centuries after the Reconquista. And it's this blend of Moorish design but mixed with Christian architectural traditions.
So even though the Moors weren't in power anymore, their art still kept going strong.
Exactly.
Huh.
And it wasn't just religious buildings either.
Oh.
A lot of Spanish and Portuguese palaces, they used Moorish elements. Like, take the Alcazar of Seville, for example. It's this amazing royal palace. It's got courtyards, those horseshoe arches, and, of course, those Moorish tiles. It's like textbook Mudejar architecture.
So we see these Moorish design principles all over, in religious buildings, in regular buildings, even after their rule ended.
That's right. And, their influence goes even further. Even Renaissance and Baroque ornamentation, the styles we usually associate with Italy and France, they took inspiration from Moorish geometric designs. It's subtle, but it's there if you know what to look for.
Wait, really? Renaissance and Baroque? That's like centuries after Moorish rule in Spain. It's mind-blowing that a culture that thrived so long ago could still be having such a big impact on European art and architecture.
It is, and it shows you the power of cultural exchange. Ideas don't stay in one place. They travel, they change, they get reinterpreted. And the Moors, they were masters of those geometric patterns, the tile work, their sense of proportion and harmony. Those things made their way into European design in subtle but really powerful ways.
Makes you wonder if we even fully understand how much they influence Western civilization as a whole. It's like we're still finding those connections back to the Moors.
It's a question worth thinking about. We tend to view history as these separate periods and cultures, but the truth is, it's much more fluid, more interconnected than that. And the Moors are a great example of how one civilization can leave a lasting mark on the world, shaping art, architecture, even the way we understand science and live our daily lives.
It reminds us to be open to learning from the past and recognizing how different cultures have contributed to our shared human experience.
Couldn't agree more. And it reminds us that what we call Western civilization, it's really a mix of influences from all these different cultures and traditions.
You know, it's funny, we think about the past, like, it's so different from today, but then you look at something like Moorish architecture and how it influenced things, you realize it's all connected. You know, it makes you think, what are we doing today that'll still be around hundreds of years from now? What ideas are we borrowing from other cultures that'll have that kind of impact?
It's a really good point. We're always building on what came before us, whether we realize it or not. And the Moors are such a perfect example of how sharing between cultures can create something truly amazing.
So before we finish up our deep dive into Moorish architecture, I want to bring it back to our listeners. If you could give them one thing to take away, one thing to really think about, what would it be?
I think it would be this, the next time you're in one of those grand European cathedrals, or even just walking through a courtyard with all that beautiful tile work, take a minute and think about the Moorish influence that might be right there in front of you.
Oh, yeah.
That geometric pattern on the floor, the shape of the archway above you, that peaceful courtyard with the fountain in the middle. Those elements might go all the way back to the Moors and their incredible artistic traditions.
Like a treasure hunt, looking for those little echoes of the past in the buildings and places we see every day.
Exactly. And it reminds us that architectural history isn't a straight line. It's more like a tapestry with all these threads of influence going back and forth across time and continents.
And the story of the Moors is definitely one we should celebrate and remember. They didn't just build beautiful buildings, they built a whole civilization that valued knowledge and art and ingenuity. And their legacy is still inspiring us today.
Very well said. And who knows, maybe exploring their legacy will inspire our listeners to see the world in a new way, to appreciate the beauty and how connected human history really is.
Absolutely. So to all our listeners out there, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those deep dives going. You never know what incredible discoveries are waiting for you. Until next time.